So we return to Scott Nappalos' um, democratic centralism in practice and idea. And I've noticed a few things and what we might call errors here. One, there is a conflation of democratic centralism and vanguard party principles, which were both parties of the Bolsheviks and the SPD. Um, there is also not a lot of the discussion of the way democratic centralism was used in the SPD and in the Second International, because it was. It actually led to some documentary problems, as I mentioned last time. But the conflation of vanguard partyism and the professional revolutionaries with democratic centralism actually adds tenets to democratic centralism that weren't there. However, the author has noticed some of the same things that Lars Lee has noticed, that democratic centralism changed over time, that it seemed to have one meaning between 1905 and 1907 and another in 1921, that a lot of this came out of the context of a civil war, and that particularly if you separate it from the vanguard party principles, which again were not unique to the Bolsheviks, you can see that maybe this isn't actually something that is totally unique and can explain everything in the problems of the Soviet Union. But more so, it actually indicates a whole lot of other problems. Now, Nappalos repeats the claim of state capitalism, which I don't even think early Lenin would have disputed, but there's no actual stating what the primary forms of capitalism are other than class domination, which is not unique to capitalism. In this text, there's a lot of issues that come with being relatively sloppy and accepting various historical frameworks, but it does point out that the idea that this is only a problem for the Bolsheviks and something unique to Marxist-Leninism is not entirely true. All right. So, democratic centralism beyond Lenin, as we get into part 4 here. So we're in the fourth section in this, if you've been following along. And let's get going. Hope in the West, question mark. Even before Lenin fell and Stalin rose, the Bolsheviks lost allies. A growing amalgam of left communist opposition, councilists, the ultra-left and anarchists. I guess ultra-left here is the Italian ultra-left or Bordagist, built upon their non-Leninist traditions and struggle and revolutions across the globe. Well, the Bordagists were Leninists, so that can't be who they're referring to. I'm not sure. Generalizations like this, if you're saying that the Bolsheviks lost allies, which they undoubtedly did, that Mensheviks, Social Democrats, councilists, all kinds of people, Bundist, some of them consolidated into Bolsheviks and some split, social revolutionaries, but just listing councilist, ultra-left, and anarchist doesn't really tell me that much. Anyway, still, some want to have their cake and eat it too. Okay, which some and what cake? What about those inspired by democratic centralism, but who either had critiques of or broke from the practices of the Bolsheviks? I will look at a few figures to get the sense of the field. Though one can't possibly look at everyone who wrote anything about democratic centralism, I hope that by spanning theorists diverse such as Gramsci to Borda, Italians, we can get a sense of what role the concept played. Antonio Gramsci is one with credentials that would aid democratic centralism. Gramsci came of political age in the libertarian milieu of industrial Turin. I guess he means councilist. I hate when they use libertarian this way because it's a vague generalization instead of saying anarchist and anarchist allies, because not all libertarian socialists were anarchists. But anyway, Gramsci, though still fond of some rather unenlightened critiques of anarchism, peace specific, he cooperated with the anarchist workers' movement in Turin during the Red Years. Of all the Leninist figures, Gramsci is perhaps one of the most thoroughly libertarian leaning. or at least problematizes a narrow reading of either tradition. I guess one of the things he's talking about is Gramsci's mild defense of the left opposition, even though he still Bolshevized the party, the Italian party. Gramsci surprisingly wrote very little explicitly about democratic centralism because it wasn't that major of a platform plank. The one place he takes it up in some detail is the Modern Prince during his internship in a fascist prison. And I would say internment in a fascist prison. There are a few unique elements of Gramsci's interpretation of democratic centralism that set it apart from the Bolsheviks. Gramsci sees democratic centralism not merely as a set of characteristics of an organization or a method for internal decision making, but additionally a process embedded and shaped by history. Organicity can only be found in democratic centralism, which is, so to speak, a centralism in a movement, i.e., a continual adaptation to the organization to the real movement, a matching of thrust from below with orders from above. A continuous insertion of elements thrown up from the depths of the rank and file into the solid framework of the leadership apparatus, which ensures continuity and regular accumulation of experience. Democratic centralism is organic because, on one hand, it takes into account the movement, which is the organic mode in which historical reality reveals itself, and does not solidify mechanically into bureaucracy. And because at the same time it takes account of which is relatively stable and permanent, or which at least moves in an easily predictable direction, etc. Now, some of this organic talk seems to be a debate that was unique to the Italian Communist Party. There's much less talk about organicism as a way of organizing outside of Italy. I mean, this is a key plank for Borda, and trying to get my head around where this organic debate came from and Bordiga was one of the things that made me realize that I didn't actually understand all the context of Italian communism, either of the center by Gramsci and Togliatti, or of the right, or of the left. The right is by Tasca, and the left is by Bordiga and Demin. All right. Though Gramsci's language is somewhat abstract, he appears to open the party up to being accountable to history and the proletariat as well as internally democratic. I mean, in this way, Gramsci sounds like Lukács. Particularly Lukács with the modifications that he did on tailism. Right? That is to say that for Gramsci, a democratic centralist organization is such only when it is able to adapt and reflect the real movement of the working class struggle. But there's a dialectical relationship up and down there. Okay. This is, moreover, internal to its concept of democratic centralism. More along Gramsci quote. Democratic centralism offers an elastic formula, which can be embodied in many diverse forms. It comes alive insofar as it is interpreted and continually adapted to necessity. It consists in the critical pursuit of what is identical in seeming diversity of form, and on the other hand, of what is distinct and even opposed to apparent uniformity. In order to organize and interconnect closely with what is similar, but in a way that the organizing and interconnecting appear to be practical and inductive necessity, experimental, and not the result of rationalistic, deductive, abstract processes, i.e., one typical of pure intellectuals are pure asses. This continuous effort separates out the international and the unitary element, and the national and local reality is true concrete political action, the sole activity productive of historical progress. Democratic centralism for Gramsci is both an objective measure of judging the coevolution of the party with the dominated classes, as well as a methodology utilized by the party to ensure its connection and development within resistance to capitalism. This is in advance over the Bolshevik models, my friend, even you admit there's multiple models, for the theory, since it requires the political organization to be judged objectively in both terms of its role in history and its role for the class. Although you get into the same problems you get with Lukács, where this seems circular. But anyway, again, somewhat obscurely, Gramsci seems to apply a more pluralistic operation of political organization through engagement, coexistence, and synthesis of political opposition as opposed to authoritarian practices. Unfortunately, Gramsci does not fully break from the Leninist model, though he perhaps lays down the paving stones for an exit route. Or maybe he actually realizes the early Leninist model was what they were aiming for, and the later Leninist model was a concession to the Civil War. I don't know. This element of stability, see the first quote, within the state is embodied in the organic development of the leading group's central nucleus, just as it happens on a more limited scale within parties. The prevalence of bureaucratic centralism in the state indicates that the leading group is saturated, that is, turning into a narrow clique which tends to perpetuate itself as privileges by controlling or even by stifling the birth of oppositional forces, even if those forces are homogeneous with the fundamental dominant interest, e.g., in the ultra-protectionist system struggling against economic liberalism. In parties which represent socially subaltern classes, the element of stability is necessary to ensure that the hegemony will be exercised not by privileged groups, but by progressive elements organically progressive in relation to other forces, which, though related and allied, are heterogeneous and wavering. Not exactly clear. All right, Gramsci understands the problem of rising bureaucracy and their antagonism to subaltern classes, but retains the division between the rulers and the ruled, between centralized power and the class organized. This is not merely an issue with some forces being better organized or having advanced ideas, but the existence of a political class with a special organizational powers and in the position of authority in relation to the subaltern classes. Not sure that's what that says, my dude. In other writings, Gramsci argues that the proletariat can only develop embryonic consciousness, which lacks full development without revolutionary communist party. Long quote. Democratic centralism requires an organic unity between theory and practice, between the individual strata and the popular masses, between rulers and ruled. The formulae of unity and federation lose a great part of their significance from this point of view, whereas they retain their sting in the bureaucratic conception, where in the end there is no unity but a stagnant swamp. Drain the swamp. All right. On the surface, and a calm mute, and no federation but a sack of potatoes, i.e., a mechanical juxtaposition of single units without any connection between them, as Marx said about the French peasantry. All right. Likewise, in other places, Gramsci speaks of organization, which seems to suggest a belief in the sufficiency and necessity of presumably revolutionary vanguard leadership. Quote, in reality, it is easier to create an army than to create generals. I don't know that that's true, Gramsci. It is equally true that an already existing army is destroyed if the general disappear. That's mostly true. While the existence of a group of generals trained to work together amongst themselves with common ends soon creates an army, even when there is none. I'm not sure that's true either. There's a bunch of generalizations that I'm not sure are true, Gramsci. All right, reading Gramsci charitably, and I don't know why one should, perhaps we can excuse or even read out the more authoritarian interpretations of that division. Indeed, it could be seen as a fluid and more historical than organizational. These readings may in fact be unfair to Gramsci, but it creates a dilemma. Take Gramsci at face value when he accepts the problematic division in democratic centralism which threatens the more libertarian elements he puts forward. If on one hand we find the more libertarian elements in his thought, his stress on praxis, the movement and the ruptures of history, the necessity of federation, organic intellectuals, etc., it should be reasonably asked, in what sense is it democratic centralism? The problem is that the short of that division, it's unclear what would distinguish democratic centralism from other organizational methodologies, forms, and histories with completely distinct practices and concepts. Anarchism and socialist practices mirror some elements Gramsci describes, but fail to take up the democratic centralist call from orders from above. Well, sometimes you do. Sometimes you do. All right. We are not interested in Gramsci here, but whether Gramsci provides a basis for reclaiming or revising democratic centralism. It is quite possible that Gramsci indeed broke with Bolshevik theory, but such a break would hardly leave democratic centralism as a coherent concept intact. Though merely a side point here, it should be noted that Gramsci does something unique with organizations. By attempting to understand and develop organizational theory as a dynamic within history, he puts it on a footing which goes beyond mere structural proposals. This points to the need for historically specific strategies for organization. Yes, it does. That's already implied in Lenin and in Lukács and in Marx. Okay. And for our organizations to evolve with their practices and struggle with the popular classes. While easy to understand, this conception of practice and historically rooted theory is generally absent or underutilized from most traditions of left thought. As an opponent of Gramsci provides an interesting counterpoint. Amedeo Bordiga, once a large figure in Italian socialist and communist leadership and a leading figure of the left communist current, rejected democratic centralism outright. Yeah, but he did it on opposite grounds. Then Gramsci is replying to Bordiga in part when he addresses organic centralism, which the Bordigists counterposed to democratic centralism. Bordiga thought that through critique of democracy in general as a product of bourgeois society and contrast it to communism, which have no such corollaries since communism implies the abolition of classes and the state, Bordiga agreed with Lenin's argument for tight centralized parties, but rejected the democratic portion for somewhat related reasons. Bordiga said, the meaning of unitarianism and of organic centralism is that the party develops inside itself the organs suited to various functions, and called for the party to eliminate the structure of the starting errors of Moscow International by getting rid of the democratic centralism and of any voting mechanism, as well as every last member eliminating from his ideology any concessions to the democratoid, pacifist, autonomous, or libertarian trends. But that's from late Bordiga. Bordiga's early critiques of democracy, like from 1921, are actually not that strident. And it's one of the things that you see as Bordiga develops is this increasing stridence around organicism. It's there in early Bordiga. We see organicism mentioned in the Leon theses, and that's what Gramsci's responding to. But Gramsci's not responding to late Bordiga because that's not published yet. And I actually am one of the people who insists there's actually a pretty big difference in tone and emphasis, although maybe not totally in ideas, between pre-1927 Bordiga and post-1948 Bordiga. Bordiga was prone to polemics and obscurity, and the last quote comes from his left communist period following World War II. Looking to an earlier time when he was more opposing the Bolshevization of the communist movement, he was the last to call Stalin the gravedigger of the revolution to his face and live. Yeah, that was true. We gain more insight. I believe this is from the Democratic Principle. Let me check. Yep, 1922. I'm going to cover this in full eventually. Democracy cannot be a principle for us. Centralism is undisputably one, since the essential characteristics of the party organization must be unity of structure and action. The term centralism is sufficient to express the continuity of the party structure in space. In order to introduce the essential idea of continuity in time, the historical continuity of struggle which, surmounting successive obstacles, always advances towards the same goal. In order to combine these two essential ideas of unity in the same formula would be to propose a communist party based its organization on an organic centralism. For Bordiga, then, democratic centralism borrows from bourgeois society democratic formal mechanisms, voting procedures, layered semi-parliamentary structure, and merges them with a centralist orientation of unity around the communist program. This is a rather crass formulation of Bordiga's quite insightful distinction between content and form. Communizers make a lot out of this too. For Bordiga, the content of communism was primary, and the party was rigorously centralized around that content. Though he opposed Gramsci, we see a few hours where they differed and a few where they are of apparent agreement. And Gramsci and Bordiga were opposed, but not that opposed. A lot of the hostility between them is actually post-mortem when Togliatti really writes Gramsci out. And they don't agree, and Gramsci was part of the group in Leon that sidelined Bordiga, even though Bordiga, ironically, was democratically more popular. It's interesting that we tend to see them as two opposing figures. I tend to see them this way, even reading it from the Borda side for a long time. And then the Togliatti side pivoted that way, but it doesn't seem like they were totally hostile to each other. There seems to be indications that Borda tried to get Gramsci off the prison island, for example. But anyway, Borda was for continuity and a trajectory, while Gramsci was for movement and induction. Borda was against democracy. Gramsci was roughly for it, although not the bourgeois form. Borda raises the issue of centralism, though in a way which demonstrates the field of contestation. Borda's critical intervention maintains centralism in its place as a point of agreement, even if an artificial, stagnant, mechanical one. In other words, Borda and Gramsci disagree on the meaning and practice of democracy, but agree partly on centralism. That agreement problematizes any attempt to make centralism more innocuous. Centralism is not merely doing what you say you do, but rather a more fundamental hierarchical power of minorities over majorities. Jacques Camat, an ultra-left figure once close to Borda, but who split from the Bordagist movement for a variety of reasons, mainly he seems to stop being a Marxist, criticized these positions on democracy and centralism. We're not going to talk about what positions Camat actually ended up holding, though, are we? All right. The Central Committee of the party, or the center of any sort of regroupment, plays the same role as the state. Democratic centralism only managed to mimic the parliamentary form characteristics of the formal domination. An organic centralism affirmed merely in a negative fashion a refusal of democracy in its forms, a subjugation of the majority to the majority, votes, congresses, etc., actually gets trapped in even more modern forms. The result is in a mystique of organization, as with fascism. This was how the PCI, the Communist Party International, Borda evolved into a gang. Well, I think it's sectarian, but that's just me. I wouldn't call it a gang. It is interesting here that among the extreme of the ultra left, it is again taken without question that it is a role of the center that is in question. The question of centralism, then from Leninism to the left opposition to the ultra-left rejection, do not contest that concept of centralism during the heyday of theory. Unless we grant Gramsci a level of exceptionalism, however we constitute it, the debate around democratic centralism involves an understanding of the role of organized hierarchical center with directed powers. A dialectical alternative, question mark? Moving to a different tradition, we have looked to the structuralists that came out of Europe and Latin America for an alternative for reconceptualizing Marxism. Though infamous for being apologists for the worst of Stalinism under Althusser, some of the structuralists, such as Palansas, embraced seemingly libertarian positions, such as the autonomy of the state, if only from a problematic revisionist Marxist political economic perspective. Okay, go into what that means, friend. These thinkers, Balabar, Palansas, Marta Hanecker, etc., inspired a generation of revolutionaries in Latin America and the Caribbean who sought more liberatory forms of Marxism and were pluralistic in their influences. Also, there's an indication that Althusser actually had a critique of Stalin, even if he was Marxist-Leninist. And that's from his late works, although by that point he was kind of crazy, so who knows. In the article, Should We Reject Bureaucratic Centralism and Simply Use Consensus, Marta Hanecker presents arguments for democratic centralism against bureaucratic centralism correctly. I love when you already just show that you agree. She asserts that for a long time, left-wing parties operated along authoritarian lines. Usual practice was that of bureaucratic centralism, influenced by the expressions of Soviet socialism. All decisions regarding criterion, task, initiatives in the course of political action to take were restricted by the party elite, without the participation or debate of the membership, who were limited to the following orders that they never got around to discuss, and in many cases did not understand. For most people, such practices became increasingly intolerable. Unfortunately, against these experiences, she makes a character of its critiques by contrasting it only to the largely anti-organizational perspectives, such as the excessive faith in consensus decision-making procedures alone, aka a lot of the shit we saw in Occupy over 12 years ago. Ignoring the crass straw men in her argument, she promotes democratic moves such as supporting positions of minorities and encouraging full debate while discouraging majorities from dominating and crushing opposition. At the same time, she is quite explicitly embraces the binding authority of decisions by the higher levels on the base and all the baggage that it brings with it. For the sake of unified course of action, lower levels of organization should respect the decisions made by the higher bodies, and those who have ended up in the minority should accept whatever course of action emerges triumphant, carrying out the task with all the other members are leaving or splitting. That's what I would add to that. Again, she makes an identification between democratic centralism and unification, not merely of positions, but rather of a centralized decision-making authority. The combination of a single centralized leadership and democratic debate at different levels of the organization is called democratic centralism. Emphasis in the authors. I don't see emphasis here at all. All right. Moving to a second facet of democratic centralism, Harnacker presents a different perspective. Unlike Gramsci, who sees the role of democratic centralism as a movement in time of the relationship between the masses and the party, Harnacker sees the same movement and dialectic between levels of struggle in the party. It is a dialectic combination in the complicated political periods of revolutionary fervor or war that there is no alternative than to lean towards centralization. In periods of calm, when the rhythm of events is slower, democratic character should be emphasized, which is actually the old position. I mean, Lars Lee points out this was kind of the Bolshevik position prior to 1921. That's why a lot of things listed above that were said to be related to democratic centralism aren't, because they didn't care about democratic centralism when they were in the underground. They had far bigger things to worry about. They being the Bolsheviks. All right. Gramsci seeks to use democratic centralism as a method for building a unity of democracy and centralization, or perhaps centralization is a democratic process of bringing together the diversity in the mass struggle within revolutionary organizations. Yet Harnacker is closer to Borda and seeing them as polar opposites. Taking them dialectically in this fashion, we would rather wonder when the dialectic is overcome and what comes next. The synthesis, well, the abolition of the state and the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat through its success would probably be the synthesis indicated here, but I don't know. The implications are not comforting, as increasing struggles negate democracy, and that does not give us the tools to understand how to avoid the errors of official communist nations and all their barbarity. This must be contextualized as coming from an intellectual of the party elite writing from Havana. The deeper point is not about the extent to which Honecker has come to question the legacy of the Bolshevik-inspired national experiments. Rather, it is about the debate about democratic centralism by its adherents revolves around two poles: the issue of structural centralization and the dialectical movement of the process of democratic centralism. Positions differ on how the dialectic is understood, how the structure is produced and relates to the masses, and how it stands via the party, and the question of externality. Yet we see the ambiguities present at the birth of democratic centralism carry through the theory into the later incarnations. Gramsci came closest to breaking with that tradition, but without the ideological apparatus to climb up that wall. In his case, it may have been both the fascist prison and the Stalinist wall of communication surrounding him that prevented his escape, or elaborating a separate conception. Where's the stuff on Palancis and Althusser and all that in here? Because they also have ideas here. I'm not going to add it for you if you're not going to add it, but just talking about Hanukkah and not dealing with the other people you invoked is a structural flaw there, Scott. All right. This essay is interesting, and that I do think it actually points out some of the implications of the tension between democracy and centralism already implicit in the Bolshevik shifting on emphasis, depending on what time period we're talking about the invocation of democratic centralism in. And I also think it makes clear that claiming that all democracy is centralist makes democratic centralism sort of an irrelevant concept, so why insist on it? But there's a lot of flaws in this analysis too. As I pointed out, it tends to take vanguard theory stuff as dependent on democratic centralism, although both are in both the SPD and the Bolsheviks. There's no reason to assume logically that one set of priorities necessarily leads to the other. You could have non-centralist professional revolutionaries, for example, and you could have I mean, theoretically, you could even have councilism that was centralist or non-centralist. It's hard to say which would trump here. I mean, it doesn't actually answer the problems of the party state or the difference in concessions of war versus general functioning, and how concessions of war might lead to distortions in general functioning, which Bogdanov was worried about way back in those times. If you want to go listen to that, listen to the 2 lectures that I talked about with Lars Lee was dealing with democratic centralism. You can find them here at Radical Engagement. They should come before this series. There's a lot to parse here, and I don't think we're going to have an easy time parsing it. But we'll come back to democratic centralism in practice soon enough. Also, there's just a lot of anarchist stuff in here that I wish was more elaborated and not taken for granted. This author seems to assume that they're talking to an anarchist audience that mostly agrees with them. I don't understand all this internal preaching to the choir stuff, but whatever. All right. On that note, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon if you want it, and protect your peace.